The whole concept of today's level up is really around training smarter, not harder.
Mm.
Um, I reckon one of the biggest pitfalls we see in health, but mainly training, which will be more of today, is people just overtrain. Um, like when it comes to health and fitness, everyone's just obsessed with more cardio, more squats, do more reps, do more personal bests, just spend more time in the gym, which um as a wellness club, you'd think we'd be like, oh, that's actually great, spend more time in the gym. But honestly, like the more mentality often leads to people plateauing, declining their results, overtraining, injuries, illnesses. So there's a real cost to somebody doing that much work or that much volume or that much intensity. And I want to discuss that today. So
Great, great. I'm so looking forward to that because it is in my head. I need to do more. You guys have made me realize that it's better to do it properly than a whole lot of it.
yeah, well, it's mainly because we're playing a
You
long
know,
term game with everybody. And everyone thinks in terms of the immediacy, whether it's day, week, month. But if they actually took a step back and thought about their year, they'd get such drastically different results and they'd have them for the long term. And they wouldn't be riding the roller coaster of health and wellness nearly as much as most people are. And it's definitely not as sexy to sell that to somebody.
yeah,
But the art is you can still get some short-term results. It's just you still have to think long term, which just changes the strategy that most people would apply. And most people lack strategy and they just go full throttle. And with that, it might be, I'm going to start running. They run every day.
yeah,
They end
yeah.
up with shin splints, or they train and then they train every day and they train hard. And it'll start out okay. You'll feel great. Maybe then that turns into feeling a little bit sore. Then that kind of morphs into like, ooh, getting out of bed, like my knees and my shoulders are a little bit. And then
Yeah.
a week
I,
later, that same run or workout is actually like, oh, that was difficult today. I don't know what's actually happened. I better start using some band-aid solutions like icing, or I'll take some supplements. And then a week, month, 3 months after that, you're on your physio's bed with a rotator cuff injury or a spasm in your back. And it's just been a slow degradation over the weeks or months into some form of overtraining, which
yeah,
is
yeah,
pretty familiar for most people, or they'll know somebody that's been on that
yeah.
exact journey.
My daughter.
It's
And
honestly, most
if
people.
you don't do it, I think it's sad because if you're not doing it enough because of uni or whatever, then there's emotional issues. You get upset, you get frustrated, the endorphins haven't kicked in.
Mhm.
It's quite an interesting process that the mental state then becomes involved.
And that's why I'm definitely not opposed to, like, you still need to be satisfied from your
Yeah.
training program. That's one of the most integral components to it. It's just finding an efficient way and a smart way to do that. And then people are set up not just for this small block of 4, 8, 12 weeks, but for this year and next year and the subsequent year. So today, like, I'm hoping you and whoever listens to this, hopefully they can just get a mindset around how to approach training for, obviously to get your results clearly, but to feel your best while you get there, to be satisfied with your movements, to have the energy that you want, and to not feel burnt out. Um, so as you said, it's one of the best ways that people deal with stress is by exercising. It's great for your mental health. There's all sorts of benefits, but exercise is still a stressor. So, if you exercise at intensity often, the body still has to cope with that. So we just want to find a way to do that that still allows people to get what they need from it without having the cost associated with it.
Yeah.
And it's not to say you can't train hard ever. Like, of course you can. You need to train hard and test yourself there's certain things you'll get from that. But it's just putting it up against the cost benefit of what's happening while you do that. And if people have the tools to be able to appropriately do that in their day, week, month, or whatever phase they're in, then they can attack their movement in a way that'll actually benefit them, not just immediately, but in the long term as well. And that's kind of really important. So the way I like to frame it is the right amount of exercise at the right intensity at the right time kind of equals the body feeling like you can train and then you can learn from that training, which means more than likely you get healthier and stronger as the byproduct of that. But if you have too much exercise with too high intensity too often, that's often a strain on the body,
Mm.
increase their stress from it, and the response to that from the body will be some form of breakdown or shutdown eventually.
What does that look like, a shutdown or a breakdown?
Ooh, we'll talk about it in a minute, but
All
mainly
right, hold that.
from a deep perspective, it can lead to, overtraining, chronic fatigue, adrenal fatigue. Um, that's the long-term part. And whether training would just be a small part of a much larger ecosystem of stresses that are pulling someone into that, but it's often one of the contributors for people doing a lot of movement activity. And today we want to focus on, like, obviously, there'd be mental health, there'd be external stresses in somebody's life, family and health and work and colleagues and finances and a whole bunch of things that add to the stress load for somebody. But they often compound it with their program and their movement strategy, which is adding some mental benefits, absolutely. But we want to get the physical component to line up with what they truly need from it as well.
Wow, that's great. I like it. It's almost like put it into a matrix when you talked about the right amount, the right intensity, and
Yeah.
the right time.
And
You
a
know,
lot of it,
the cost benefit to each of that, when you
yeah,
have too much of everything.
and we can track it on data. Like you could use your heart rate variability from your wearables. You could use your stress load from your Garmin's and your Apples, and that'll kind of give you data, genuine qualitative data that you can
Yeah.
actually use for your day. But there's also a perceived scale that you can give for yourself, which as people get more intuitive with how they feel about things, whether that's food, whether that's stress, whether that's how fatigued or energetic they are, and their perceived level of sort of physical pain or wherever that's at in terms of strain and how tight and achy they are, that can help us dictate sort of what our approach is going to be that day, that week, so to speak. Or we can change our recovery processes on the back of that. And people
Mm.
just are often going through the motions a lot, which I'm still wrapped that people have the consistency to do what they're doing because it's genuinely a benefit. It's just if they were slightly smarter and they asked themselves a few questions as to get more of a background onto how they want to approach it and what they want to get out of it, they would make a better decision about what they're trying to do with their training.
Makes sense.
They will come up with a few tools that hopefully people can like implement in their day, in their week, in their training.
Great. Love
So
it.
when we think about it, it's like there's kind of two processes happening a lot. If we think about like a car analogy, because it's kind of easy for the body, you've got your central nervous system, and this acts as like if your car engine, it would act as a regulator for that. So if your engine revs too high, let's say, your CNS or your car engine regulator would just kind of shut it off. So similarly, if you do too much exercise, the brain will want to protect your skeletal muscle system. So it'll just do things like it'll reduce the rate of nerve impulses that go to the working muscles. So you just can't work as hard. And most people will notice this as a decrease in strength or performance in their training. So a weight that they could do or is quite easy feels really challenging because the body's just reducing what you can do in that thing or that movement to reduce some of the load that it's under. So the body's really smart. It'll just give or take away based on what it perceives as the stimulus that it's getting or needs. We don't really get to make that decision. We can plow through for a little bit, but eventually it'll come and tell us kind of what to do. The other one to that is you get local fatigue. So it'll kind of reduce or deplete your energy system, so to speak. So whether that's actual like mitochondrial function or whether that's just your metabolic byproducts, it'll just make your muscles more tired, you'll be more lethargic, and you'll be a bit weaker. If we're using a car analogy, this would be like running out of petrol, running out of gas, really. So to sum that up, it would be training too frequently, too intensely, without prioritizing recovery or a efficient program it just means the stress kind of never subsides. You've only got your body needs to recover enough to be able to deal with the stress that we're trying to put it under. Um, and if we're still using the car analogy, it would be the same as just never actually turning the car off to put some fuel in and maybe give it a checkup, so to speak.
That's a really good analogy.
So if we were, we go back to our overtraining sort of people are just pedal to the floor. Whenever they're training hard, trying to do PBs. Whenever they're running every day, trying to increase the Ks or reduce the time that they do a 5K in, whatever that looks like. Often, and it's not a once off that we're so worried about, it's over time. We see, if we looked under the metaphorical hood of the car for the body, all your connective tissues would be a bit creaky and potentially frayed. They actually get quite inflamed when you're in that state. And that would often lead, you'd feel tight, you'd feel sore, you'd feel achy, you'd feel restricted in your movement. There'd just be a high level of inflammation going on and tightness in the body. Your fascia, which surrounds the body, gets quite tight. Things like all your feel-good chemicals and all your anabolic hormones will be decreased. Your body will have less production of them and you'll be more catabolic. So you just have much more cortisol floating around freely in the body, which actually has a whole myriad of effects to it. Like in terms of holistic health, you'll have dysregulated blood sugar, in terms of your stress load, there'll be mental health consequences. There'll be, anxiety and racing thoughts. You'll have more than likely sleep disturbances or trouble sleeping. There'll be hormonal dysregulation in terms of food cravings. You might get a lowered metabolism. Over periods of time, this is kind of what we're trying to avoid.
Doesn't too much excess cortisol also add weight?
Yep, 100% it does.
And you might have someone thinking, why am I putting it on when I should be taking it off?
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the reasons behind today's session to the more, people think more. Often the less is more, or effectively less is more. It doesn't mean you get a kind of get out of jail free card to do nothing, but being effective and strategic with when you train, how hard you train, and how often you do that, and periodizing that effectively over a 4, 6, 8 week journey gives your body the response it needs or the stimulus it needs with your adequate recovery. And that is all we're trying to do with today's session, to get people to think about when's appropriate to push and when's not appropriate to push, because frequency of training trumps higher intensity, less consistent training any day of the week. And the frequency of training, I'd much rather people be at 80 to 70% of their threshold more often than, let's say, 3 days a week, than training really hard 1 to 2 days a week.
Right. That's a good point.
Hard, inconsistent training doesn't actually equal smart, effective training.
Okay. Yeah. So there's no point going once or twice a week, but doing it at 120%.
The cost benefit's too high, because the more intensity you play with and the more you push towards 100%, it comes at a cost. So you just got to make sure the cost is worth the intensity that we're pushing. And for most people, it's not worth the cost of it, which we'll go into.
Great. Love it. So 3 times a week at 80 to 70% is pretty good.
Yep. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of factors that play into that. Often it'll get people more motivated to come into the gym because they know that they don't have to kick their own ass every single time. Normally those sessions will be shorter, which means people can actually allocate them in their week appropriately. Not everyone has 90 minutes or, works in a gym to spend the time to do it. So it's consistency and frequency that often gets the results. But from a physiological standpoint, the adaptation in the body, whether it's strength, whether it's muscular, or like putting on muscle and reducing fat, you get just as much from frequency as you do volume, intensity. And people kind of forget that. So the thing I think about a lot is just like, if you don't get to decide whether you have an effective training program or prioritize recovery. It's not actually up for us to decide, because the body will eventually decide for you. And if it doesn't get it, eventually it'll force it. And that often leads people don't prioritize, let's say, stability and recovery, and then eventually they'll get an injury. It could be shin splints on your running. It could be a shoulder injury in the gym. It could be a lower back injury. It doesn't really matter. At some stage, the body just says enough is enough, and it'll just put an absolute halt to whatever you're trying to do out on the gym floor. And we see it all the time.
Mm. Mm.
So the tool that I want people to kind of think about, and this is a training tool. It's called reps in reserve, and you'll see it in some programs. It'll be RIR, reps in reserve. It's a auto regulation technique, which is used in strength training, and it's to gauge how many repetitions you have kind of left in the tank, if we're still on our car analogy, before reaching failure.
Mm.
So let's, for an example, if we're doing any exercise, let's just say our perceived, like, the absolute most we could do is 10 reps. If we get to 8, it means we have 2 reps in reserve. So we would have 2 RIR on that particular movement. If it was 6 and 10 was our top ceiling, it means we'd have 4 RIR. Really simple.
Is that how you gauge that it's okay to keep going? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
so there's the stats say that 2 reps in reserve is kind of the perfect amount to get the adequate stimulus that the body needs for strength or hypertrophy, but not actually induce the cost that you would get if you go to failure. So it's just something to think about. And there's a bunch of ways to do it. A lot of it will be perceived for people, but you can actually test it against your 1 rep max for a lot of your compound lifts, your bench press, your pull-ups, your deadlifts, your hip thrusts, a bunch of those ones, and base it off percentages of that, which is quite complicated, which a coach can do that easily. But for most people, it's that perception of how much could I actually lift in the tank with that movement. Was I cruising through it, just talking to my buddy? Cool, you're probably nowhere near where you're shaking. And for a lot of people, it'll actually be when their form starts to deteriorate. So we call it technical failure.
I love that. That's when I realised that.
Yeah. And it's
Except
actually,
today, I think today I had, I kept going, I'll do 8 kilos with the elastic bands. And my technique was shit. So I then went off to 6. But yes, good. That's really good. So that I should trusted my gut instinct, go with the 6 kilos and then build and then do proper 8 of those or
yeah.
add 2 more to it.
Yeah, you can slightly add. You can also do things like decrease the tempo, which will increase the intensity of the movement, but at zero cost to the body, which is what kind of people forget. They do weight, 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 weight a lot, and they increase reps a lot. And with both of those, unfortunately, form normally comes at
Form goes, yeah.
once
So
form
form,
goes.
slow form is good.
Yeah, because 2 things happen. You can either catch when things aren't quite functioning the way we want or activating. That's a big win. It means that you'll get on top of something way quicker than if it's heavier and faster. And it means if you are slower, you've more than likely got more activation with better, like neuromuscularly, you should be better activated, which puts more tension through the body without the joint or the connective tissue taking that, which the heavier it goes without form, the more your ligaments, tendons, and joint will be the load bearer rather than your muscles, which
Wow.
leads to injury.
And bad form, it doesn't do much for your muscle development.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. So if you're feeling sore in the joint, we're talking front or top of the shoulder, talking lower back, we're talking hip, we're talking knee, we're talking elbows, wrists, all the joints of the body, they shouldn't be sore 2 days after you train. That's not what they're designed for. Good training doesn't lead to that. High intensity hypertrophy training often does, due to people pushing it well past what they would consider good form, and they go past technical failure a lot. So having a perceived, what can I lift on certain movements and then going just under allows people to come back more often with less cost to connective tissue, which means in the long term they reduce their risk of injury while building, hopefully the strength and musculature thereafter, and then they can do it for a lot longer.
Yeah, makes so much sense.
So the cascade we often see is people train really hard. Great. They do it really often. And then with that, the higher you get up that threshold of to 100%, the more fatigued your nervous system gets. And then that is one of the things about overtraining that people kind of don't understand. Let's say your stress cup can only hold so much, and
Yeah.
all the other external factors that are filling it up, your movement is adding to it as well. But it actually needs to be, you need to reduce the stress in the cup because training or movement is the catalyst. So what you do in the gym and Pilates and yoga and all the rest of them, that's the catalyst for change, but it doesn't actually do the adaptation that you're looking for. That all happens in the recovery process.
Mm.
It happens out of the gym. It happens with your nutrition. It happens with your sleep mainly, and it happens with the state that your nervous system's in. So high stress fatigues your nervous system. It'll cause your adrenals to kick in. You'll get adrenaline and cortisol bouncing around the body in higher amounts than we like, and that activates the sympathetic side of your nervous system, not your parasympathetic side. When that chronically happens 2, 3, 4 times, 5 times a week, just with your training, you get sleep disturbances. You might get pain and bloating in your gut health and your digestion, but you'll get that inflammatory response in the body, which in terms of the muscular system shortens your muscles, tightens your muscles. You get an inflammation in the muscles that might be slightly swollen, and then your ligaments, tendons, and joints got the brunt of that as well. And people wonder why they have so many aches and pains so often. It's genuinely because of that. The style of training they do with the lack of focus on recovery. And you can do both in a great program, but you can actually just still get it out of your training if you focus on the right amount of reps in reserve per exercise. And the solutions might kind of look like, if we had a 4 week phase, you might actually start, with about 3 reps in reserve in the tank for your first week or two. Because the first week or two is actually quite difficult. Your nervous system's just trying to figure the movements out. The newer the movement, the quicker you'll fatigue on it because your nervous system doesn't quite know what it's doing and has to develop those pathways. And then you could almost go to sort of 2 in week 3, and then you might have 1 rep in reserve in week 4 when you're kind of pushing where you want to go. And then as we go into a new phase, we might have a deload week, or we might even just do a full nervous system reset.
So that's great. That's really useful because I suppose if you're not doing it properly, it's going to um, interfere with your muscle development and the things you're trying to do. If you
Yeah,
focus too much on joints and trying to grab all that weight, you're compromising the things that you probably want to develop.
100%. We see that happen, and it happens mainly, with younger people in the gym who are just training the house down all the time, mainly with an aesthetics focus. But you also will normally increase the ratios of, like, you've got big prime movers in your body, and that's your big power muscles. We're talking, bicep, tricep, pec, quad, hamstring, glute. They will develop quickly in response to that training, but it comes at a cost. And the cost will be your stabilizing muscles and your joint health. And a program should really address all of those things. And again, as the ratio between your sort of prime moving muscles goes up, if you don't have the right amount of stabilizing muscles and the ratios between them to be effective, the same thing will happen, and eventually injury occurs just because of the strain that it's causing on the soft tissue, joints, ligaments, tendons, joint capsules, things like that,
Mm.
which is more than often what happens for most people in their teens and 20s. And then when they normally take to get injured before they decide to change the style of training that they want to do.
Injury leads to.
Yeah. Most of the people that move the best have come from an injured background because they then understand the repercussions and the cost of what certain training styles do for them.
Thanks. And the recovery that you're talking about is what type of examples?
So there's a bunch, right? So you can do it external and actually just have recovery processes. We're talking anything yin, saunas, yoga, walking, breath work, cold therapy. All of those will be amazing. Anything that's going to help your sleep, which is where the vast majority of our recovery occurs, whether that's sleep hygiene, whether that's supplementation, any of that will do the trick. In session, keeping your threshold to about 70% most of the time will also mean your cup doesn't overflow with stress because your body's in a great state as it leaves. Some stretching at the end of your workout for 5 to 10 minutes, some breath work at the end of your workout for anything from 60 seconds to 5 to 10 minutes would be amazing, because what it's going to do is it's going to reduce your cortisol response immediately and switch it into parasympathetic state then and there, which means the recovery process can happen almost immediately.
Wow. And what about stretching beforehand? Is that a prerequisite, do you think?
It's not. I would do more dynamic movements. They're far superior to sort of static stretching. And I
What
would,
do you mean by dynamic movement?
we're talking sort of animal movements, your ostrich walks,
Oh,
anything
things that we do at the gym with you
we
guys.
do. And the other one would be adding in stability type movements.
Which is
All your rotator cuff work, anything to do with the hips, anything that's going to get activation
fine.
in your stability muscles.
Okay.
Yeah, your banded walks, your clams, all of that type of stuff. The benefit is, as you're doing those, you're warming up the key areas that you need for almost all the movements you're going to do anyway. So it reduces your injury risk significantly and gets blood flow and activation into the areas that are going to be needed for what we're about to do. And most people skip those. It also means you can do it as a part of your warm up rather than another piece of your program, which just adds length to the program, which when we do that, people just don't do them.
No, that's true. And that makes sense now what you're saying, rather than the stretching, doing some of the stuff like the ostrich walk that are looking at the rotation aspects of your body.
Yeah. So the questions I would ask myself would be daily or weekly. These would be the symptoms that I'd be looking out for. Soreness, strain, pain. What does it look like? What's my rating out of 10 or 5, if you prefer? Am I irritable or agitated due to stress? What's my sleep been like for the previous night/week? And what's my energy levels in response to that? If they're low, I might address that in terms of the amount of volume I do in my training. If it's monthly, it might be weight gain, which we talked about. It might be a reduced appetite. It might be a decline in performance on things that I normally can do, but I'm struggling with now. All my workouts are just feeling more challenging. Those pains have started to become injuries. I've got digestive issues and I've actually lost motivation. They're the big heavy hitters on a more chronic timeline than the immediate symptoms from your day to week that I'm just looking out for and talking to myself about. So the last one will be sort of solutions, because it's like you can still train under stress. Like that's not the issue. It's just reduce the overall volume for the body. So, you can always take time off and do a nervous system reset. Great. Love it. Give your body the actual rest and recuperation it needs. Go and do some yoga, go and do some breath work. It'll completely, or at least top or reduce the stress load in your cup significantly to be able to then go into another phase. You can deload your sessions, so you can go keep it at 50%. Just oil the groove, so to speak, because consistency and frequency is more important than inconsistent volume. So you can reduce the load 30%, 40%, 50%, reduce the weights, reduce the reps, reduce the sets. Works a treat. You can move from more compound movements like your squats and your deads and your hip thrusts to more isolated movements, because they cause less load to the body and less fatigue to your nervous system. Obviously, add in those recoveries, or you can just start to get more efficient in what you actually prioritize. And I've been working with Anthony a lot on this year with the young kid, where we might do a warm-up set, and instead of 3 sets, we might only do 2 sets. And out of those 2 sets, we might do a warm-up set, and then the second set is the only set with intensity that we actually train with. And while we train with it, we dial in, we focus, we keep good tempo, we keep the right activation. We're pushing the weights to a capacity that's going to challenge me in a rep range that is close to my 2 to 1 rep in reserve. And we do that for that set and that set only, just to give my body stimulus, which means I can still add in extra weight through that. But because I haven't done it every set, every rep for every single exercise, my body doesn't just completely bottom out at the end of it, and my nervous system's still intact. And getting great results from that style of training as well, which is just more efficient training than let's just throw reps, sets, weights, and just put volume at the issue. And that one works significantly well too. So you can look at your weeks and adjust your reps in reserve. You can look at your session and pick out single exercises that you want to have intensity with and ones that you don't want intensity with. Or if you're doing a 3-session a week program, you could do one session that's intense. Let's say it's an 8 or 9 out of 10. one session that's like a 7 out of 10, and one session that's like a 4 or 5 out of 10. Frequency is winning, and you've just chosen when to do the intensity, which can be based either on something you've pre-planned or based on questions from your day stress load and when is the most applicable to actually implement that day.